Hello, I'm Remington, welcome. So, I've been doing some reading over the past month. I was planning on only doing quarterly wrap-ups, but I got a decent amount done to the point where I feel like I have enough to talk about in one video. So, I read mostly non-fiction this month, because a lot of it was study for research that I'm doing. So, I read 6 books this month, 4 of which were specifically about thinking, about how often it can go wrong in certain ways. One was about Palestinian history, and one was just a graphic novel that I read, just a chapter or two every night before I went to bed, just to enjoy it. And the title of this video, by the way, is in reference to Beauty and the Beast, where in that one song, Gaston starts off by saying, "LeFou, I'm afraid I've been thinking again," and LeFou says, "It's a dangerous pastime." I quote that all the time. It's one of my favorite lines. And I felt that it was fitting, given that most of the reading I did this month was about thinking. Anyway, the first book, the graphic novel, is On a Sunbeam by Tillie Walden. This book was almost 5 stars. It was almost perfect. The beginning of it is absolutely fantastic. It's a graphic novel about young love and having that taken away from you and trying to reconcile that, both personally as well as with the other person who you have this history with but is no longer in your life. And it's absolutely stunning. There's just amazing panels in here. Like, the use of color in this book is stunning. It is, it's mostly muted colors. It's set in space, so it's a lot of dark tones, and then all of a sudden, when the moment's right, it'll really brighten up. And there are some absolutely stunning panels in here. There are also some that are just like, what am I looking at? Not that they're ugly, but it's just like, I genuinely couldn't understand what I was supposed to be looking at. The reason that it kind of falls flat for me, though, is in the later half of the book, the story kind of starts growing and becoming a lot more than it was in the beginning. And I feel like a lot of the world building was kind of undercooked and didn't really feel like it was given the weight that it needed. And it kind of strayed away from the parts of the beginning of the book that were so lovely, of specifically the relationship between the 2 girls. But even though it does kind of fall flat in the later half, I would still recommend it. I feel like I can't give it more than 3.5 stars with how flat it felt in the end. But the beginning is just so strong that it makes it completely worth it. I do think another reason why I liked this book so much, I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but like only reading 1 or 2 chapters most nights. Just normally I'm reading like 50 to 100 pages of a book in a given day, and really slowing down and taking your time with it, I think, made it a lot more lovely. Anyway, the next book is The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This book is basically just a telling of Palestinian history that is gravely needed right now. It is not making any attempt to be unbiased. It's a Palestinian story written by a Palestinian whose family was very prominent in the last 100 years of Palestine. And so he makes no attempt to be unbiased, and a lot of people fault him for that, which I don't think is fair. He doesn't talk about specific atrocities that were committed against Israel in some cases, specifically the 1967 war. But those atrocities that were committed against Israel soldiers were committed by Egyptians and Saudi Arabians, I think, if I remember correctly, which is an important part to the overarching story, but it's not part of the Palestinian story. And that's specifically what this is. It's the history of Palestine, not the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But yeah, if you want to know more about the history of Palestine, I would highly recommend this one, and I look forward to reading more books on the topic as well, because I think that this kind of stuff is really important. I'm not gonna dive super deep into politics on this channel, But yeah, it's a very important issue that is going on in the world right now, and it makes me very sad that it's happening. Okay, so the next 4 books are all about thinking, how it goes wrong, and how we can do it better, pretty much. And the first one is How to Think by Alan Jacobs. This is the 3rd time that I've read this book. The first 2 times that I read it were in 2019, I think, early 2019. And it absolutely blew my mind when I first read it. So much so that I read it again right after and wrote a 6-page essay on it, which was a thing that I didn't do. I didn't write any papers in high school ever. So writing a 6-page essay on it unprompted just because I thought it was that groundbreaking for me, it was a lot. Upon a reread, it isn't nearly as strong, just because I've internalized the core messages so much so that like rereading it didn't do nearly as much for me. It was a good reminder still. Like there were some nuances that I had forgotten or hadn't been paying attention to as much as I should. So I am glad that I reread it, but it definitely doesn't hold the favorite nonfiction book of all time as it did before. Still very good. Still highly recommend it to anyone who's looking for an intro into basically the ways that we suck at thinking, but it's not the end-all be-all that I once thought it was. It's a very good general overview of common pitfalls of tribalism, indoctrination, code switching, which is basically like when you're around different people, you talk different ways to fit into the group. It's like a subset of tribalism, kind of. And he gives a lot of personal anecdotes and stories, and basically just emphasizes that you could legitimately be wrong about what you believe. And there's so many forces outside of you that have an effect on what you believe that you should hold your beliefs a lot lighter. You shouldn't hold on to them as strongly as people often do. It is worth noting that this book makes reference to Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, I think that's his name, which is a book that I have not read, but I do feel like it is important for me to note that sections of that book, which this book is partially based on, have not held up to replication studies, specifically social priming, which isn't a thing that this book talks about, but social priming is probably not a thing as far as replication studies have borne out. Probably not a thing. So just in case you do go down that rabbit hole, just know, like, not everything in that book has held up to scientific history. After that, I read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Anyway, this book also makes reference to social priming very briefly, so be warned, but pretty much everything in this book, aside from that, has a very well-grounded scientific basis. And this book is about a couple different things. It's set up in 3 parts, and each part is advocating for something different but unrelated. In the first part, he's basically setting up the idea that we are guided by intuition, by snap judgments that are unconscious, irrational pretty much, just things that feel right. He gives the analogy of an elephant going whatever way it wants, and a rider on the back of the elephant that says, oh, we should go down here by the water. And then the elephant goes the other way, and the rider basically says, well, you know what? This way's actually better because, you know, this way we can go sit in the shade over there by the trees or whatever. Basically the idea that, you know, we make snap judgments, and then with our rational mind, we justify them. The rationale comes after the snap intuitions. So not to say that the intuition's necessarily wrong, it could be right, but the reasons that we defend it are not because it's true, but because we had that snap judgment, generally speaking. In the second part of the book, he's outlining his moral foundations theory. So he outlines that there's 6 parts of the moral foundation. There's care, there's liberty, there's fairness, there's authority, there's loyalty, and there's sanctity. And he basically says that liberals value the first 2 more than any of the others. The others don't really matter to liberals, which I think is a pretty fair assessment. You know, for liberals, everything comes down to the individual being able to make the choices that they want to make, which I think is true. Liberal ideology basically boils down to individuals should be able to make the decisions that they want to make as long as they're not hurting anybody else. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's basically the gist. Whereas conservatives and more Eastern-centered cultures place an emphasis on all 6 of them somewhat equally. And he basically is making the case that that's why there's such strong disagreement and such strong partisanship in politics in the United States as well as abroad. That the reason that we have these disagreements and we can't make any progress on them is because we are so diametrically opposed with our core values. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. I do think that and this might be a little prideful for me to say, but I do think that if you really break down all of the other moral foundational principles that he lays out, I do think that they all basically wrap back around to harm reduction. But that's outside the scope of this video. I'm not going to talk about this here. And the last major point that he makes is basically what he calls the conservative advantage, which is that since conservatives appeal to all of the moral foundations that he lays out, he says that they have an advantage because of the community that the other 4 foundations that liberals don't put value on. That these other 4 foundations create community structures in society that are vital to its longevity. And his main criticism of liberals is that they're breaking down these structures made to hold society up because they're oppressing individuals without having anything to replace them necessarily. Throughout reading the book, sometimes it was kind of frustrating because he doesn't go out of his way very often to clarify that he's saying that this is descriptive, this is just how people are. And sometimes it comes across as if he's saying that this is how things should be, which he's not. There's the elephant in my brain going down this road of like just trying to be offended, but like how could somebody think like this? Which is the very point of the book. Like he's telling me why they think like this, and I'm just like, that's so wrong. So I really enjoyed this book. It really changed my view of how people come to the conclusions that they come to. It's very important that if you're going to, be talking to people and be judgmental, I guess, about their beliefs, it's important to understand how they came to them and how you came to yours, and having a little bit of humility in how you hold those, because beliefs are complicated things. You don't have them just because they're true. You may think that they're true, and you may have done so much research and like genuinely come to that conclusion rationally, but so may have that person. Like it's complicated. It's not as easy as just right and wrong. There are so many other forces. Good book. I'd give it probably 4 stars. And then right after that one, I read The Misinformation Age by Calleen O'Connor and James Owen Witherall. This book is all about scientific consensus and how it can go wrong, essentially. It starts out very small with how even perfectly rational scientists with good data can end up believing in something that's false if they don't have access to all the data. And it gives a couple of the stories of how scientific consensus has been led in the wrong direction, even though there was good data, because people weren't willing to acknowledge it. Such as in the 1840s, I believe, with germ theory of basically surgeons who would wash their hands would have their patients get infected less and therefore die less. But of course, gentlemen's hands couldn't carry germs. Like, that's a ridiculous notion. So as the book goes on, it expands the model more and more, adding more people into the equation, such as propagandists, journalists, policymakers, just adding another cog in the wheel of where things can break down and be led astray, intentionally or not. And so as we see, like, it could go wrong just with perfectly rational individuals trying to do good science. As we grow the model more and more and see more ways that it can go wrong, it can be kind of scary to think about. There's so many ways that science can go wrong, and more broadly, this is also applicable to just beliefs in general. This the book talks specifically about scientific beliefs, but it also applies to, everything else that someone would believe. Okay, so I'm definitely rambling at this point, but this book's very good. I would recommend it. Not quite as strongly as The Righteous Mind, although it's not like it's a different kind of book, even if it's in the same subgenre. But I'd recommend, if you're going to read these books, I would recommend starting with How to Think if you just want like a light introduction. And then The Righteous Mind is a lot more rigorous and academic. And then The Misinformation Age is a good add-on to that, but it's not something that I'd necessarily say is a must-read. And then the last book that I read last month was Cultish by Amanda Montell. This book was a lot less academic, which was very nice after coming off of 2 very academic books. But it's all about the language of fanaticism, and basically Cultish being a language that people speak to varying degrees. It outlines the death cult of Jamestown and how that is like the strongest end of the spectrum. And it also goes into like social media fitness influencers and how they use some of the same language tactics to basically get people to commit and stay in their little cult of personality. And there's a huge spectrum of super culty to less culty and everything in between. And it's very interesting to see all the ways that people use tactics intentionally and sometimes even not, just to manipulate people and get them to do what they want, and some of the ways that they go about doing that. It was really interesting. After I read this book, I read Unfollow by Megan Phelps Roper. I just finished it a couple days ago, so I don't want to get into it too much. But like in this book, talking all about how cults use these tactics to manipulate people, and then reading a book about Megan Phelps Roper experience in a cultish Baptist church. I saw a lot of the correlations between these 2 books. Felt like this book had a good mix of being very approachable, as well as just having enough rigor to it to really get its point across really well. So yeah, those were the books that I read this month, and they were all pretty good. I didn't have a single one this month that I was like, this isn't it. All of them were like 3.5 to 4 stars. I don't think, none of them were like amazing reads, but they were all very impactful to me in one way or another. So I would recommend all the books that I read this month. Anyway, I hope that my ramblings have been somewhat coherent, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.